Hello and welcome to this week's Wildlife Matters podcast. I'm your host, Nigel Palmer, and this week's episode offers a unique perspective on the Badger Cull, a national day of action that took place last week. Wildlife Matters joined hundreds of other wildlife advocates outside Parliament in London for the Badger Cull, a national day of action. The event was organised by the Badger Trust and supported by groups such as the League Against Cruel Sports, Protect the Wild, Animal Aid, Born Free Foundation, HSI UK, and a whole host of badger groups from all around the UK. Wildlife Matters, along with many of the Badger Army, has worked in Parliament and in the coal zones to end the policy of culling badgers. This policy is cruel, ineffective, and has cost us as British taxpayers around 100 million to date and rising. And it has killed over 230,000 innocent badgers. We're going to bring you some of the excellent speakers on the day, starting with Rosie Wood, the chair of the Badger Trust, then a rousing talk from Rob Pownall from Protect the Wild, and then Dr Alice Brough, a veterinarian who left the profession for the same reason that she joined it. She loves animals. Alice's talk provides an insight into the horrors of the intensive farming industry in the UK and how so-called food chain animals suffer on British farms.
Indeed for coming along, as my colleague Peter has said. So what do we think about the policy change from the government then? Yeah, my thoughts exactly. Of all the things that the new government could have made a big hit on, could have pointed to the absolute disaster of policy over the last 14 years, and made a lot of gains, saved farmers a lot of money, saved the taxpayer a lot of money, being truthful with voters, the public, farmers and parliamentarians, this would have been it. But they bottled it. Not only that, but they have broken a number of electoral promises. Yes, they did say they would end the cull, and no, they didn't say when they would end the cull. As a former civil servant, I'm very used to politicians saying they will do something and not being entirely sure when they're going to do something. But this one really takes the biscuit, doesn't it? So to the end of January of this year, over 230,000 badgers had been slaughtered. That's very close to half the English population of badgers. At the beginning of 2012, what proportion of the English cattle herd was prematurely slaughtered following a positive bovine TB test? Anyone? And what proportion of the English cattle herd was that? 0.5%, half of 1%. In 2022, it was 0.4%. Spectacular reduction, I don't think. And that was as a result of a whole raft of measures. I had asked my colleagues which was their favourite DEFRA lie or dirty trick I should treat you to this morning, and they said too many to choose from. So I thought I would just run through a couple of my own personal favourites. So here's one. Old policy. is actually a policy pack, the doubling of cattle testing in the high-risk area, bringing into line with cattle frequency testing in Wales, the increased use of a much more sensitive cattle test, bringing into line with testing in Wales, much tighter cattle movement control, not yet bringing into line with cattle movement control in Wales, and requirements for hygiene on farms, not yet bringing into line with requirements in Wales, plus badger culling. All of that is known as the badger control policy. That has allowed DEFRA to claim erroneously but sneakily that any reductions in bovine TB have arisen from the badger control policy, which has also allowed them to sneakily and mendaciously tell us that 56% reduction in herd risk of bovine TB followed the badger control policy. Now, for those of you who actually read the Birch report, you know that's nonsense because Birch says that's nonsense. But the Badger Trust had to resort to going to solicitors and getting DEFRA solicitors on the record for DEFRA to confess, and you can see this, we'll post it for you, that DEFRA admit they do not know what, if any, proportion of bovine TB has been affected by culling badgers. It comes to something when a very small wildlife charity has to go to solicitors to challenge the Secretary of State through his solicitors to get them to confess what science has known since RBCT. So that's one of my favourite dirty tricks. My other favourite dirty trick is the amount of BTB that remains hidden in the cattle herd. The current test in England might leave between 50 and 15% of all infected cattle undetected. However careful the farmer, however careful the vet, this is not blaming farmers, it's not blaming vets. This is squarely blaming DEFRA and DEFRA policy, which the guys over there could change at the stroke of a pen. And they could do it without damaging the farming industry, because they could pay enhanced compensation to farmers to take up better cattle testing, to take up the cattle measures which will keep their herds safe and keep people's livelihoods safe. They could do that at the stroke of a pen. Unfortunately, at the moment, they're willing to spend many millions of pounds not doing that. When we asked DEFRA through a Freedom of Information request why in England DEFRA chose to use the least reliable standard test in cattle in England, DEFRA's holding response to me was, well, we need a bit more time to answer that because the answer might be commercially sensitive. In other words, it's an awful lot cheaper, they think, to hide disease than to admit it exists. I'm so glad DEFRA weren't in charge of COVID, aren't we? However, Wales does use a more reliable test, so Wales identifies more disease. And the Welsh Government, having been alerted to this problem, have now challenged DEFRA data to stop misrepresenting Welsh data on the same scale as English data for bovine TB, pretending it's using the same scale, which it clearly is not. So hopefully on September the 11th, when we get the next DEFRA data drop, we'll see a more truthful picture of the difference between England and Wales. If Steve Reed is listening, I'm absolutely sure he's not, but if he was listening, he could show a little bit of ambition, couldn't he? Let's start with an honest appraisal of the real extent of bovine TB in the national cattle herd. Be ambitious, Steve. At the very least, use the same standard of testing and hygiene they use in Wales. Go for it. Have a bit more ambition, Steve. Go on. Use the same test they use in cattle in Europe. They're a hell of a lot more reliable. To export live cattle to Europe, you have to use the same test they use. Why not use that here? Why not relieve farmers and taxpayers of the burden of hidden disease in the cattle herd? And then we can stop messing about pretending that badgers or deer or soil microorganisms or anything else are to blame. The badgers are innocent. Of those farmers, and I admit it was not very many farmers who responded, but of those farmers who responded to the Badger Trust survey in 2023, to the question, do you think badgers should be culled regardless of BTB, 87.3% of those responding farmers said yes. BTB is an excuse for a lot of the culling. Let's not forget that. End the badger cull. You could do it today. You could save the amount of money that it would otherwise cost you to pay 400 newly qualified nurses. I know what I'd rather spend it on. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosie. Rosie's 24/7 against the badger cull, as I'm sure everybody here is. So it's great to hear her speak. Next up is Rob Pownall from Protect the Wild.
Yeah. Hello everyone. I've actually written a speech today just to make sure I don't rant too much and say things that are going to get me in even more trouble. So I'm going to follow this word for word, which I wrote about 10 minutes ago. If I've met you in the crowd already, you'll know my views and the views of Protect the Wild. So yeah, here goes. Thank you for coming, first of all. Thank you for supporting ourselves and the other brilliant organisations here today. Most importantly though, thank you for supporting the badgers and for caring. Badger culls are an affront to a civilised way of life. They're an attack on democracy and they're an attack on science and logic. Badger culling started over a decade ago, and yet ridiculously, here we are today outside Parliament, still fighting for it to end. It is clearly not the solution to dealing with BTB, otherwise we wouldn't be here, would we? The issue lies in the herd, and it's about time farmers take responsibility. The awful conditions in which cattle are kept and the poor hygiene measures in place in which cows are literally walking around in each other's shit is the main reason that BTB remains rampant. Badgers have been scapegoated for far too long, and farmers have got off the hook as they continue to profit and gain from the exploitation of animals in their care. It is time to address the elephant in the room that without animal farming itself, badger culling wouldn't be happening. Without people consuming milk and other animal products and driving demand for this cruel industry, then badger culling wouldn't be happening and we wouldn't need to be here in the first place. We can't just keep addressing the symptom of an awful, awful industry that shouldn't be there in the first place. How long are we going to continue to address the symptom and ignore the root cause of the mess that we are in? And as we look forward, tens of thousands of badgers are still set to be slaughtered under this new Labour government in a shameful and disgraceful policy that shows nothing has changed one bit since the Tories left government. Until 2029, this iconic British species faces years more of intensive culling because this government are too afraid to do what's right. It's time to end the badger cull, not in a week or in a month or in 5 bloody years' time, but today. The badger cull must end. Save money and serve the working people is what Labour promised, and it's about time they delivered it. Please keep up the pressure. Join those on the ground in the coal zones. Sign petitions, write letters, keep attending demos, speak to your local MP, do everything and anything you can to help end this madness for good. And together we will hopefully see the day where all animals are left alone and given the right to live.
Thank you, Rob. And so our next speaker is Alice Brough, who is a ex-vet.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Okay, hello. So briefly, I'm a farmer's granddaughter and a vet. I worked as a commercial pig vet for 4 years, with ranging from your small family farm to your giant industrial factory farm, hundreds of Britain's pig farms under my care. But I started off in mixed practice before that for over a year in dairy, beef and sheep. Speaking up within the industry saw me banned from premises, and subsequent whistleblowing has landed me in all sorts of predictably challenging situations. And I'll just preface this by saying that obviously everything I say, all these opinions are my own. I grew up very much immersed in nature. I had the full complement of beetle, bug and bird books, and I had a little microscope for closer inspection of leaves and feathers. And I joined the veterinary profession because I love animals, and I left because I love animals. The way I saw nature and her creatures treated by our food system was truly something I could have never been prepared for. When you've been involved in death on an enormous scale, you realise that life is so very precious. During lockdown, I spent huge amounts of time in an arboretum, which was closed to the public. I sort of climbed in the back. But during that time, without all the manicuring and the disruption, the renewed abundance of creatures was incredible. I had really close encounters with fox cubs and deer and birds I'd never seen. It was very much my Snow White era. But outside of this arboretum, the UK is particularly tragic in its biodiversity. We're in the bottom 10% of countries in the world. This biodiversity, this rich mosaic of life, is essential for our survival. So this tapestry of different species within functioning ecosystems protects us from disease. It's a buffer for pandemics, alongside, of course, many other benefits to our health, not least allowing us to be able to produce food. Without this natural buffer of sort of self-limiting populations, genetic variability, and geographic spread, we're susceptible to disease transmission from wildlife to us to farmed animals and vice versa. The spill of pathogens onto farms, which happens because, of course, in creating these farms, we're encroaching on natural habitats, allows the establishment of a disease reservoir. Our movement of livestock, their waste and products, distributes these pathogens, and the sheer volume of almost genetically identical animals in small spaces allows an opportunity for disease to learn how to evade immune systems, how best to spread, and evade also the medicines that we throw at it. Why are dairy cows seemingly more susceptible to TB? I'm sure many of us will be familiar with the effects of chronic stress on our own health. So let's for a moment think about what the dairy cow goes through in her life. Genetically selected for obscene milk yields, 10 times more than her calf would ordinarily drink. They're repeatedly inseminated to carry a baby for 9 months, to then have that baby taken from them straight after birth. Farmed animals are stressed, they're sick, they're dropping dead. 46,000 pigs are dying each week on British farms, not the ones that make it to slaughter, on farms. 46,000 a week, that's just the pig industry. That's why are badgers coming onto farms? Where I live, Shropshire, one of the Cull zones, 86% of our land is agricultural. In the UK, 83% of all agricultural land is used for animal agriculture. So I'm to assume that 70% of my entire county is taken up by livestock. So why are badgers coming near farms? Why are any wild animals coming into areas of human development? Simply because we've left them precious little option. We've destroyed their homes and we've killed their food. And it seems our conditioned reaction to that is to villainise the wildlife themselves, rather than face up to what we've done. Farmers and landowners have been pushed this idea that badgers are the problem. It was something to do, and it prevents industries taking accountability. And now they can't get that idea out of their heads, despite it being based on wrong information. We know that many other animals carry and spread disease, including bovine TB. Pigs get it. Are we to cull the entire pig industry to protect the cows? We can get it. Perhaps we should steer clear too. This is a pattern. Foxes are killed to protect sheep farm profits. Birds are shot indiscriminately in the name of feed conversion, or are hunted to protect the pig industry under the guise of controlling a disease that we don't even have. Pigeons were domesticated for our use and then dumped. They now don't know how to fend for themselves, and we hate them for it. Deer are managed without question, and I'd implore you to look up Randall Plunkett and Dunsany Estates and how his growing deer population intuitively manage his woodland to perfection without any interference from him. These ecosystems maintain balance naturally. We learn that in primary school. I've seen farmers liberally scatter rat poison open to any passing wildlife, and then laugh as they kick poisoned rodents into the pig pens to be eaten. One of countless hideous incidents I could share. But the point is, these wild species, persecuted largely by farmers and the rural elite, are, unbeknownst to them, essential to everything they hold dear. Badgers play a vital role in ecosystems. They're very important predators, and ironically, their unique predation of small mammals likely provides protection to a lot of other livestock diseases. Small mammals are, of course, all over farms because, once again, our fault. They are filthy and there's feed everywhere. Rewilded ecosystems can store and sequester carbon, reduce effects of flooding and climate change, vital for future farming. What doesn't do that is livestock grazing. So this trendy term that we hear a lot, regenerative farming, was manufactured by the industry to make us feel better about continuously consuming their damaging products. What's actually regenerating in regenerative farming? It's not biodiversity, and it certainly isn't the cow. In fact, the only species that really seem to benefit from livestock grazing are dung beetles. If we were to introduce more widely a level of livestock into wild spaces that could just about be maintained without causing huge damage, we would afford ourselves approximately 1 piece of meat a year. So beware these constantly emerging fairy tales. The reality is that industrial agriculture has taken hold of Britain. We're outnumbered by farmed animals, land animals, and one. And this has obviously come through rising demand. Over a third of our pig and poultry industries are effectively owned by global meat giants. 85% of our farmed animals are factory farmed. And that figure doesn't include things like RSPCA assured farms, which I can assure you are essentially factory farming. And we also import huge amounts of these products, plus feed for our animals, using 1.4 times our land footprint to do so. So consider what goes into these animals and then comes out in the slurry. Vaccines, hormones, antibiotics, parasiticides, steroids, anti-inflammatories. The sheer volume of chemicals, disinfectants, biocides used by the gallon, the single-use plastics, the poisons, the toxic flybait, rodenticides, the list goes on. Just 50 cows are capable of emitting the equivalent amount of pollution as a human settlement of 10,000 people. The Environment Agency have clearly stated that the majority of river pollution comes from farming, and that the majority of inspected dairy farms have been actively polluting in breach of regulations. Back to TB, needless to say, spreading vast quantities of infected feces all over our grazing land, crops and waterways is a bit of a risk for maintaining and spreading disease. So this and many other good points were made in the Brian May documentary I'm sure everybody watched. But I feel there's a couple of points in that I want to address. Firstly, desperate farming families seeing cattle slaughtered, crying as they, quote, load up their best animals in their prime of life. Somebody's got to say it. That is the entire business model for animal farming. As someone who's been involved in... And I say this as someone from a farming family, I've seen the emotion, but as someone who's been involved in mass culls and has the PTSD to show for it, it's not nice, but why are we having to do it in the first place? And how is it different to business as usual? Secondly, the fury at being forced to diversify, forced to change, as if every other business doesn't have to adapt to societal progress and modern knowledge. The suggestion that not forcing it might be a good place to really triggered the NFU, didn't it? Yeah. We appear to have collectively lost our minds on this one. I mean, can anyone think of a single disease we've managed to eradicate without an effective vaccine, a test that actually works, or appropriate biosecurity measures? They're not doing farmers any favours with this blunt resistance to change. The government propping them up with subsidies and bailouts are ultimately not helping. For some reason, over a century of having this disease, we're still not implementing scientifically relevant options. Why? Trade, money. It always comes back to this. As long as they're able to sell a product, I'm afraid they don't give a damn about health, welfare, or environment. A good example of this, last year, AHDB Pork, which is like the levy body for the pig industry, acted on clear messages from members to focus on marketing, exports, and reputation. And so they've ditched their pig health scheme, which was health monitoring at abattoirs, and their real welfare outcome scheme, meaning that vets don't have to perform any sort of objective welfare assessment on red tractor farms. It's incredible they feel confident publishing that. So what's the solution? Where do we place that hope that I felt a little flicker of during lockdown? Those of you that attended the Restore Nature Now March this year, I'm sure will have noticed that almost all of the speakers emphasise that we must rewild. This is the key to every problem we're facing. But then other than really Dale Vince, sadly isn't here today, didn't explicitly allude to exactly where the land for that rewilding will come from and what is actually required of us to free up that land. So if you take away nothing else from this, let it be this. 76% of farmland could be rewilded with a transition to a plant-based food system. Globally, nearly a quarter of our entire land mass freed up for wildlife. And badger culling would obviously be irrelevant at that point. I haven't plucked this out of thin air. The largest study to date was a recent comprehensive meta-analysis that looked at nearly 40,000 farms. The team of researchers at Oxford University started that study, omnivores, and ended it vegan. They concluded that the single biggest thing we can do for the planet and its inhabitants, including the badgers, is to be vegan.
Well, the crowd are certainly responding to the vegan message and the ending of the intensive farming practices that exploit animals, pollute the countryside and waterways, and produce dairy and meat that hurts our health. The farming industry is in a mess. And the next speaker was experienced wildlife campaigner Dominic Dyer, author of the book Badgered to Death and former CEO of the Badger Trust.
Thank you, that's great. I'd just like to say, let's just have a round of applause for the Badger Trust and everyone that's here today. The Badger Army is alive and kicking, and it makes me feel so good to see so many of you here. You know, back in 2016, I wrote this book, Badgered to Death, The People and Politics of the Badger Cull, and I hope some of you read it. It was sent to every MP in the House of Commons because we raised £15,000 in a week to actually send it to them. But for me, that was my journey of trying to lift that veil of incompetence, negligence and deceit at the heart of this policy that has led to 230,000 badgers being slaughtered, the biggest destruction of a protected species in living memory. Pushing animals that have lived in parts of our country since the Ice Age to the verge of extinction. As Mark has just told you, killing most of those animals by a controlled shooting method that the government's own committee, when it set it up in 2013, said was cruel and ineffective and left many badgers to drag themselves off to die, 5 minutes or more of blood loss and organ failure. Do any of you think that's right? It's an utter bloody disgrace. But you know, it's cost nearly probably 60 to 100 million pounds of your money to do this. And it's brought no benefit whatsoever to the farming industry. Every so-called piece of peer-reviewed research that DEFRA has issued has got more holes than a Swiss cheese. And every academic involved with it, when you push them, says, yes, we can't say it's about the badgers, because there's a whole mix of measures we've got going on here, in control measures, biosecurity and testing regimes. So we haven't got a bloody clue, to be quite frank, how much badgers are contributing to this, but we're going to kill them anyway. That's utterly insane. Utterly insane. But the biggest tragedy for me, 8 years on from writing this book, is standing before the House of Commons after the biggest Labour election victory since 1997 to find that this government might go on for this for 5 more bloody years. That's an utter disgrace. Would you agree? And you might ask yourself, why did we get to that point? Surely people like me and others around here that have been working so hard were constantly working with Labour in opposition, and they were putting great manifestos out, even with badgers on the cover, saying they would stop the badger cull. Yes, they were. But I can tell you now what's happening at the very moment in Downing Street is that Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer are preparing the ground to go back in with the National Farmers Union and tell them the brutal reality that Brexit is going to cost the farming industry a huge amount of subsidy support, and there's going to be less money for that industry in the future. And you know what? Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer and Steve Reed under their command has been told to keep the farmers on side for badgers, as we have to give them the rough, horrible medicine on reduced subsidies for their rotten, intensive industry that we hear today causes so much suffering, so much pollution, and ultimately has to change. Wouldn't you agree? And that is the tragedy of all of this. Because between 2013 and 2020, when I was at the Badger Trust, we did something very special. We galvanized public opinion in this country. We brought thousands of people onto the streets and towns and cities, from Bristol to Brighton, from London to Leeds, in over 45 different protests. I know many of you were there, because I remember your faces. That became the biggest wildlife protest movement this country had seen, and it gave birth to Hen Harrier Day. It gave birth to Extinction Rebellion and all the other wonderful campaign groups that we've seen that have started to rise up and say, you know what? You can't put a price on nature. You can't put a price on wildlife. We just have to stand up and we just have to protect it. Would you agree? For too long, I'm afraid, this debate has all been about the livestock industry and about its economic viability. It's not about changing the livestock industry and valuing nature and our natural landscapes. And we must bring that balance back to this debate. Everyone has a choice, quite rightly, about what they choose to consume food-wise. But ultimately, what we shouldn't all be doing is subsidizing a farming system that at its heart has inherent cruelty, has a massive disease risk element based upon it, is causing huge climate changes, because it's not just the water companies that are causing that problem, ladies and gentlemen, it's the farming industry as well. And that's the brutal reality that we have to deal with here. Wouldn't you agree? I always said, and many of you have over the years, that badger culling is the canary in the coal mine about the future of our natural landscapes and our wildlife. We are one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world. But we're also a country in an economic crisis and a cost of living crisis. And there's a crisis about trust and integrity in that place behind us, because most people, I'm afraid, don't trust politicians of any parties. And I have a sympathy with that view. Wouldn't you agree? Yeah. What they've got to do, what they've all got to do, regardless of their political party, is to prove that actually, rather than short-term political economic interests, they're willing to look at the long term. They're willing to look at why we are such a nature-depleted nation, why we must return our landscapes to wildlife, why we must farm, produce food, produce energy differently, and not build homes regardless of the environmental impact they will have. We all need to be homed in this country. But protecting our environment and our greenbelt in the face of what we see from industrial agriculture and urban development that has caused so much damage must be an absolute priority for this government and every MP in that chamber. Would you agree? Yeah! So all I can really say to you is this. This is a long battle. We could see another 5 years of culling. I wouldn't rule it out at all. because political compromise is in the air. I fully support badger vaccination. Let's do it because it's good for badgers. But let's not deceive ourselves that by vaccinating badgers, we're going to get the farmers to give up wanting to kill badgers, or we're going to solve the TB problem in cattle, because that's just not going to happen. And we need to stay united as a wildlife protection and conservation movement, that no more badgers should die, no more should be disgustingly slaughtered in the way they have, no more taxpayers' money should be wasted. There is no excuse, and we need to call out the DEFRA officials who've lied, the government ministers that continue to lie for them, the livestock vets, the academics in Oxford and Cambridge and other places that have constantly blamed the badger when they know damn well that this animal is an innocent victim of an intensive livestock industry that has spread this disease into the wildlife corridor. And let's not forget where this TB disaster came from. It was after foot and mouth that they restocked our cattle, that they brought them up from the southwest. They didn't put in place the control measures responsible. In 2001, there were 4,800 TB reactors in the herd on average a year. By 2003, there were 28,000, and it hasn't fallen, no matter the fact that you've killed 230,000 badgers, probably spent £100 million on the biggest wildlife destruction policy that any of us can remember. So enough is enough. Stop the killing. Stop the badger blame game. Hold the farming industry to account to change for the good of society and the environment and animal welfare. And let's leave our precious wildlife alone and value it for what it is. And we must keep standing up and we must keep fighting for it. Thank you very much.
Wow, what a characteristically rousing speech from Dominic. He has really got the crowd buzzing. I've worked with Dominic for over a decade now, and I know he can be a Marmite character, but whatever you think about him, he can undoubtedly rally folk to take action. The final speaker of the day was Chris Packham. Chris brings his passion for wildlife and nature and delivers it in a geek fest of badger poo and snot that keeps you captivated as he tells his stories to make Britain a nature-rich, biodiverse country again, and not the current nature-depleted mess that we're all living in. It's an absolute pleasure for Wildlife Matters to introduce Chris Packham.
What brings you here today? What's led you to emerge from your set somewhere in the UK? What's led you to scuffle down to Parliament Square to stand up for a badger? I'll tell you what's led me here. A love for life, everything that creeps, crawls, slithers and slimes. An initial fascination to want to understand that life, how it works. Growing into a time when it became apparent to me that that life was being rapidly diminished and that I'd have to actually do something to try and prevent that. But also to a massive pile of shit and a tiny piece of snot. Let me explain. In the early 1980s, I embarked upon a project looking at badgers in two parts of Hampshire, some lowland dairy farming and the New Forest. So every Sunday I would go out and I would collect 20 bags of badger poo. And I'd carry them home and I'd triple bag them to try and reduce the smell. And I would put them into my mother's freezer. She was overjoyed. And then every Thursday night, I would take the badger poo out and I would take it to a lab at Southampton University, and whilst the rest of my peers were watching Top of the Pops, I would peer down a microscope and see what the badgers had been eating. And I could see quite clearly where they'd been foraging from the leaf litter, counted the number of earthworm cheetae, those little hairs that earthworms have, so that they could propel themselves forward. And I figured out that the reason that the badgers in the dairy area and the New Forest were living completely different social lives was shit. Because in the dairy area, there were plenty of earthworms. We'd opened a badger supermarket, lots of improved short grassland where the badgers could go and access those worms easily, whereas on the acid soils of the New Forest, access to that primary food was restricted, and they couldn't defend territories big enough because they didn't have enough shit to go round. And that's why I'm standing here today, because that little bit of science that was unknown at the time gave me an advantage in my academic career, and it allowed me to progress to the point that I was able to do the job that I do today. So that's the shit, the badger shit. And I loved collecting that. I loved going out and counting the badgers, just as Rachel's described, those moments of anticipation when you think you see one in the darkness, where you start to imagine badgers, frankly. You think a piece of bracken in the moonlight is a sow with her cubs, and then you wake up and it's not. They're enigmatic, they're charismatic, they're inaccessible to many people. They play a massive role in our culture. We're naturally drawn to them. It's true that all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others, and the badger is one of those. During lockdown, like Alice, I reconnected with the badgers. I was very fortunate to have a set on my doorstep, and I went up and I dug a hole in the ground on the edge of the set where I could lay flush with the ground, and I put out food for them, and I started photographing them. And on one occasion, the cubs had become so accustomed to the fact that I was there that I was filming them on my mobile phone, and some of the peanuts that I put out were between my face and the phone that I was holding out. And one of the little cubs nudged under the phone, and it brushed its nose against mine. A little piece of snot nose that wasn't mine. That connection with life, a life that you love so much, is what brings us from our sets to this square today. We mustn't forget that for all of the stats, for all of the science, our fuel when it comes to our motivation is that love for life. That's what brings us here today. But essentially, to make any argument, love is never enough. And we have the science, we have the stats. You've heard them from Rosie, you've heard them from Alice, you've heard them from Dominic. This cull will be a blight on my life and all conservationists of my generation and age. Because, yes, whilst we've been presiding over trying to protect the UK's wildlife, we've lost nearly 250,000 badgers. That guilt weighs heavily. As Dominic said, there are many of us here today who've got up pretty much every single day for that period of time and done something to try and protect these animals. But ultimately, up until this point, we have to admit that we've failed. They have killed 250,000 of them, despite that fact that that's been underpinned by astounding ignorance. Why is that then? Because if we understand why we failed up until this point, we might succeed in the future. Well, I postulate there are a number of reasons. Firstly, look at us. Look around you. Who do you see and who do you not see? Who's missing from this crowd? Who's missing from this crowd that purports to care about the UK's wildlife? Where are those people who we pay our subscriptions to and read the magazines? When it comes to it, they haven't been standing up as forthrightly as us. Why? Well, because they don't want to upset the farmers. You see, aside from the civil servants and aside from the politicians, it's not just them that don't want to upset the farmers, it's been the conservationists too. But the fact is, as Alice has so poignantly, pertinently and precisely pointed out, farming is in a mess. And our farmers need our support to get them out of that mess. And what's clear at the moment is that we are not running DEFRA. We all know who's running DEFRA. And we all know where that influence comes from and how powerful it is. It's not the NGOs, is it? We don't have that access because we don't have that funding, we don't have that long-term ingratiation and access to power. We don't want to make enemies of the farmers, but the Cull has done everything within its power to do that. Not only has it been destructive in terms of killing badgers, it's been enormously divisive when it comes to conservation, not just of badgers, but of all of our wildlife. And that has been enormously detrimental. It scares people. They don't want to pick a fight. But unfortunately, we're in the last round. We're in the midst of a biodiversity crisis. We've had 4 state of nature reports which are telling us quite clearly, with very good data, that our wildlife, our habitats, our landscapes are going rapidly to hell in a handcart. So we can carry on as we have been doing, paying our subscriptions, being nice, being timid, or we can finally summon the energy to take the fight that we need to. And at this point, given a new government that have made promises, it's time for us to hold their feet to the fire and demand that they keep them. Not acquiesce to a fob that they've made with that farming lobbying fraternity that are in there in DEFRA at this moment in time because they've got passes that sweep them straight in the door. They don't even queue. They've got their own access. It's time for us all to say boo to the NFU. Let's hear it. Boo to the NFU. Boo to the NFU. Boo to the NFU. Unfortunately, we may have to upset some of the farmers. That doesn't mean that we can't help and support the others. The policies that they put in place to mitigate the anger of their fraternity have not been supportive, they've been destructive. And it's time for us to call that out. It's also time to call out all of those who are missing from our ranks today. They should be here. Because, as we've heard, this is not just about badgers. This is about the health of our ecosystems. We know that the badger here is simply a symbol. And we know from those state of nature reports that all of those ecosystems are imperiled. So if we're truly standing up for our wildlife, we need to stand up for those symbols, the badgers who are being culled, the foxes that are being hunted, the hen harriers that are being illegally slaughtered on grouse moors. But let's not forget the bigger picture. The bigger picture is that everything that creeps, crawls and slimes is in trouble, and that without it, we are in trouble too. And that brings me to one last point. Within this crowd, within our fraternity, even when it comes to focus on this one issue, there are factions. We have different ideas. We have different motivations. We have different energies, and we have different egos. My parting plea to you at this point, this critical point, when we're looking at a massive pile of 250,000 bloodied dead badgers, is to put all of that to one side. If we want to solve this problem, we need unity. Let's focus on our commonality, forget our differences, and make a difference. Thank you.
Well, what a great question from Chris. What brings you out of your set for wildlife? And we would love to hear your answer. Wildlife Matters is a vibrant community and we want to hear your opinion. So please leave us a comment on Instagram, Facebook, X or Threads, or you can drop us an email. Our email address is info@wildlife-matters.org. Wildlife Matters is proud to be one of the Badger Army and to support those dedicated folk who put boots on the ground in the Badger cull zones for the 11th consecutive year. Back in the original Camp Badger, none of us would have believed we would still be working to stop the cull and possibly be doing it for another 5 years if the Labour government does not find the courage to stand up and deliver what they pledged, to end the ineffective badger culls. And you can bet that we will hold them to their pledge to ban trail hunting as well. September is always a busy month as the hunters begin to hunt this year's fox cubs and the hired killers begin to shoot badger cubs and families. Wildlife Matters will not stop standing up and speaking out to give wildlife a voice and to end the persecution of our native wildlife and the destruction of our countryside and biodiverse ecosystems. We hope you found the Badger Cull National Day of Action inspiring and impactful. Full video coverage of the day is available on the Wildlife Matters YouTube channel, where you can witness the collective efforts and the impact we can make when we stand together for wildlife. Please do subscribe when you get there, and don't forget to share the Wildlife Matters podcast and YouTube channel with everyone that you think would be interested. Thank you for your continued support and for being part of the Wildlife Matters community. Sadly, time is against us again, so until next time, I've been your host, Nigel Palmer, and this is Wildlife Matters signing off.